know
I
there's
hope
not many
so. Come
people.
on in, Rosie. We're ready for you.
I know she'll make it up for Trisha.
Yeah,
She could take
exactly.
notes.
Well, Rosie, we're glad you could join us with Stasia. So thanks so much. Hold on. Let me get the right one pulled up.
I'm sorry. I have all of my stuff blocking your spot. I'm so sorry.
Cool.
I have a perch next to me with a pillow on it, but of course I put all my books on it, and I'm like, I'm so sorry.
Well, that's perfect. It's totally perfect. Okay. So we'll start with the Cooper article, or not article, but the Cooper chapter.
Mhm.
Asia, were you able to read chapter 27?
Yes, I actually let me pull that up too because I was
Cool.
taking a couple notes on it.
Beautiful. And what I love about this is, again, it's a really great overview. It provides like a really quick analysis of like, here are like the great things about this thing or these things,
Hmm.
right? And here's also the limitations for each one of these things. It's clear and concise, essentially, in my opinion.
I never realized how many different assessments there were too. I was like, oh,
Yep. And we're going to get really in depth with like the different types of experimental functional analyses too. Because I know too, in this section, it talks about doing it in their natural environment. And that's
mhm.
what we're going to talk a lot about because that's really, in my clinical practice, been the most effective. And I say that when we talk about like, and we'll get into this when we talk more about like risk benefit analyses too, and why. Because I'm going to present some horror stories during that time, which is always fun. Okay, so what were some of the comments that you came up with from the Cooper chapter?
Let me. It's of course it's taking forever to load because technology.
I 100% get it. And, we're in a retrograde right now, so it happens. Um, so
Perfect. I just
again,
did a lot.
go ahead.
I did a lot of highlighting. I know that because I try to take bits and pieces from it so that way like the fillers aren't extremely overwhelming.
I am a highlighter for sure, and I like to color coordinate my highlights, so I get that
Me too.
100%.
I have green and yellow. Love that.
Yep. Fantastic. So I 100% get it. That's how my mind works. That way I can
Oh,
pick and choose things out. Yeah.
I found them. So for this one, let me see if it'll do it if I can kind of like move that a little bit. Oh, yeah. So I was looking through like the FBA and intervention section. I think that it should be under role of functional behavior assessment in intervention and prevention.
Yeah.
So I was looking at like the altering antecedent variables and altering like the consequences and stuff like that. When I was reading it at first, I was kind of like, this is a lot of professional jargon that I need to unravel.
Yes.
So what I did, I love my notes are funny because it like I talk out loud when I'm saying it. So for like the alter antecedent variables, I wrote basically they are saying that finding the before that triggers the behavior is helpful in figuring out what the best way to alter it would be. For example, I was looking through like the example that they were trying to explain about like if water triggers the problem behavior during hand washing, then the water would be eliminated and substituted with something else.
Yeah.
And also I loved reading about this too because I liked how they were talking about how it also couldn't have been the water, it could have been the lunchtime in general that was causing the
The,
behavior.
the
So
whole
what they would
context,
do is,
right? Yeah.
yeah, and they would have like the break between when she was washing her hands and then they used
100%.
like the icon for later before she went into the lunchtime, which I love because I also wrote a note that was like, not only is that helping with the problem behavior, but it's also going to help problem behavior because now you're working on functional communication. Because the
100%.
problem might have also been I have kiddos, I have nonverbal kiddos. So I know if a tantrum is happening, a lot of the time it's because they're not able to tell you what specifically is wrong. So them using I use a PEX board, I use AACs, I use all different types of stuff and you notice once they get that in their
Mhm.
hands, it's like a whole new world. So tantrumings decrease
Yep.
significantly. They're able to actually tell you what's going on. That's why I
100%.
loved reading this because I was like, oh, my kiddos do that.
So this is what I love about the this is what I love about the FBA in general is that you're like, oh my God, yes. So like
Yep.
I do a lot of things like that where it's like almost backwards, right? Where it's like,
Mhm.
so I get it because I see it, right? Like you're in the classroom, you're like, I'm seeing this work every single day. Now I've got like the research essentially to back it up.
Yep.
And so now you're getting the this is why it works
Yes.
because there's the function, you've identified the function without you even knowing that you've identified the function. That's what you've done, right? And then
Mhm.
what you've done is presented a function-based intervention for that communication to be the adaptive skill that's being taught. So
Mhm.
that then the consequence then is that they automatically get that need or that want met without having to have the tantrum behavior.
Yep.
So isn't it beautiful?
I love it.
This is ABA. This is ABA 101, right? Like this is the beauty of our science. This is
Yep.
where you're like, but this is why it makes sense. This is why like like all of that stuff that everybody else is saying, you're like, that's cool. I completely understand that.
Mhm.
This is our science though, right here.
Yeah. Because I always have conversations with parents, like of my nonverbal kiddos, where they're like, we can't get the tantruming down. Like, how are we going to present this? And I was like, I want you to tell me that you want something without telling me. And then they're like, and I go, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Now imagine being 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old, and they want something really badly and they're not able to communicate to you. Kind of like infants when they'll cry,
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that, to get your attention for what they want. They're not able to explain that yet. So slowly showing them like pictures and stuff. So like I'll
Yes.
introduce like not even I some of my kids don't have a full PEX board, but we have like icons of things that are very rewarding to them or like the simple
Yes.
sign.
Well, and
Yeah.
they're not just rewarding to them, they're more than likely something that has to do with their function or at least
Yes.
contextually what they're going to need.
Hmm.
So, well, I was about to talk about something, a CEU event that I did, and I was like, nope, that was not this audience that I was talking to. Sorry. So, but one of the things that we talk about a lot is like the function of our behavior is often going to shift based on what context that we're in. So, if you put me in a highly aversive environment, I'm going to want to get out of that, right?
Hmm.
And that's where this negative reinforcement comes into play, right?
Hmm.
Hold on, that's up here. Um, so that's where that negative reinforcement comes into play. So like I'm gonna want to escape that
Hmm.
aversive stimulus or stimuli in many cases,
Yeah.
right? However, I might also be in a social context where I'm contacting positive reinforcement with positive attention. And I'm like, yes, this feels good. I'm going to keep doing this
Hmm.
until there's something that shifts in the environment that might make it more aversive to me. So like let's say that we're having a conversation like what we're doing right now, but then
Yep.
there becomes like added noise. I might then start to shift to where I'm focusing solely on that noise. And then
Hmm.
I'm like, I'm not contacting social reinforcement anymore. Right. And so
Yeah.
I'm going to start removing myself, trying to escape that environment.
Hmm.
And a lot of times there's no communication on my part that other than like saying like, hey, I gotta go, right? And you're like, well,
Yeah.
that was weird. What just happened? But our kids do that all the time, right? And you're
Yes.
just like, what just happened? Something
Hmm.
that we don't know, right? And that's why it's important that we're really analyzing the whole environment. And I think that the chapter here really does kind of simplify that in so many terms, with the exception of, you're right, it's a lot of jargon. Welcome
Yeah.
to
I
any
do,
sort of
however,
science.
I get my books on Vital Source. I don't know if you've heard of
Mhm.
them,
Yeah,
but highlighting and note taking and stuff has been so much easier because I learned about it in my undergrad and it like saved me.
yeah.
But I also really liked, hang on, let me see. Oh, tell me if this is correct, only because when I wrote the note, I was like, I hope I'm kind of explaining it the way that I think they're explaining it. So then I went to the alter consequence variables. I said, basically, in order to avoid the continuation of escape maintain behavior, we want to make sure that the previous negative reinforcer is not followed by the problem behavior, and rather provide reinforcement for alternative behaviors.
Yeah. So typically, but it's also important that we recognize this. And this is a huge misconception that happens in our field. Reinforcement happens over time. So one time of providing a preferred consequence to a behavior is not necessarily going to increase the likelihood of that behavior unless it contacts reinforcement over time. So, like if we go back to the tantruming situation, and let's say we go back to the situation of like hand washing, well, if they are constantly tantruming whenever the water's turned off, and they're like, yes, finally, this tantrum's working. I'm getting the water
Mhm.
turned off, and everybody's like, oh man, what's going on? But ultimately, I don't really care what anybody else is saying because the water's off, and that's all that I
Mhm.
really care about. The water's really aversive. So what would be then over time is like if we continue to allow that type of escape to happen. But
Mhm.
that's where we as behavior analysts have to come in with our science and figure out interventions that are
Mhm.
going to shape an alternative behavior that allows for the tantrum to stop, but also eventually we see the learner tolerate the water so that they're not using antibacterial hand sanitizer. They're actually washing their hands because science indicates that that's actually a better way for us to get germs off of our hands rather than
Yeah.
using hand sanitizer, right? And also, we can't prevent water everywhere.
Yeah.
So when we think about real life context, like what if somebody 5 years from now, Stasia, you're no longer around? And I see this happen all the time. You're no longer around. And then suddenly the aversive stimulus presents itself in a person who doesn't know this learner well enough to know that, crap, so who turned on the water? I thought everybody knew not to, right? Somebody's going to turn the water on one day, right? And she's going
Yeah.
to freak out and nobody's going to know why.
Isn't that I know this probably, well, I don't think it would be off topic, but like usually, because I completely understand, because whenever there's a staff change, there's always usually an issue because sometimes there's not communication and we don't
Yeah.
kind of tell, hey, I've been with this kiddo for 2 years. This is what kind of happens. There's no, is it stimulus control transfer
So
where it's like you,
it's really just a generalization issue, in all
okay,
honesty. Um, Stimulus generalization, some sort of environmental generalization component, and that sometimes cannot be prevented, essentially, right? Like especially like uh, staff changes are like the number one thing that I see it with, because it's a new audience. So it's like, okay, well, now let me just at least see if I can
yep.
contact what I want for it. Um, And if they're going to let it slide or they're going to give it to me, sweet. I found my new source. And that's really just kind of human nature too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually had that happen. My supervisor came out with me for a observation the other day for her kiddo, and they haven't seen her probably since they were babies, like really little.
Yeah.
And they were all over her. And it was funny because sometimes I have trouble like doing what was it? Doing trials with my kiddo because her sister is younger, so she's always like, I want to be in it, I want to be in it. And I love involving her, but sometimes it's a little difficult to get her on task. So
Yep.
it's like I have never seen her perform so beautifully for
Social
someone. And it
contingency.
was it was funny because I was
Yeah.
like, and my supervisor was like, "Are they always like this?" I was like, "No."
Nope.
I was
But
like, "You're
here
new.
you
They want to
are,
impress
new
you."
audience member. They are
Yep.
performing for you. So going back to the altering consequent variables question that you had. So essentially,
Mhm.
yes. So, but the one thing that you really want to think about too is like, so there are things that will evoke the behavior, right? The antecedent,
Yep.
or allow it to be emitted, however you want to say it, however you want to identify the stimulus to the response,
Mhm.
because essentially an SD and a response, the exact same thing, right? To antecedent behavior, right? But then you have to look at what's happening afterwards. So the consequence might be pro-social or negative social, or it might be automatic, right? Social, automatic or negative or positive as well. So you also have to look at that. And then is that where you need to modify. And in most instances, whenever it comes to behavior plans, you're going to have some antecedent concept or some antecedent strategies that are modified or like
Yeah.
variables that are modified and some consequences that are also modified. So, and then giving them the opportunities then to contact the preferred reinforcer,
Mhm.
right? And not contact it for the behavior such as tantruming or aggression or whatever else it might be.
So I actually have a kiddo that we have a DRA in place.
Hmm.
Um, is that kind of in this realm? Because her behavior originally was like, I don't know if I describe it as like those old cartoons where you would see somebody slip on a banana peel and they like flop back.
Yeah,
So like she does that. So like she'll from a straight up position just throw
actively
herself.
flop. Yeah.
So what we did, we put this in place like 2 years ago. She's doing phenomenal. But we did a DRA for it where basically we would take her and do like a controlled roll
Hmm.
and we would like do reinforcement for that and like over time rather than flopping, she then started to roll on the floor rather than doing the flop. And then now she won't even do it on the floor. Now she rolls like onto the couch or she rolls like onto the bed. So like
Right.
rather
So
than
you
doing
just
it like
shaped it
on a hard
into a
surface.
safer alternative for
Yeah.
her. Yeah. Because essentially, too, were
Cool.
you able to figure out what the function of it was?
It was originally, it was because mom, so she needed mom in the room at all times. So, like, if mom was out of the room even for like 3 seconds, it was one after the other, after the other, after the other until she came in.
Hmm.
Um, so then what we started to do was we had two programs in place. So we did the DRA, but we also did time away from mom. So we started with like 30 seconds. If she could
Yeah.
make 30 seconds, we were doing like activities and stuff. She was reinforced. Um, we did the DRA multiple times during that time period too. So like I'd be like, "Oh, let's get up, let's roll." So then we do like
Yeah.
a cool roll.
So really what
Um,
you were doing then is both. So the way that you were altering the environment, right, is that you were giving her this alternative behavior that you were teaching her so that she was contacting this kind of like fun reinforcement essentially,
mhm,
right? And then you were also teaching her another skill, which was to like wait and tolerate the absence of mom, also
mhm.
contingent on the on her preferred reinforcer, right? So you've
Yeah.
got those multiple schedules in place. And so that's where you've got both things happening, which is awesome. And that's why it
Yeah,
works.
she's on 45 minutes to an hour now without mom
Fantastic.
and without her tablet, which is the biggest thing
Yeah.
because the tablet was like the thing that she could be with without her. And then I was like, let's see,
Let's
because
see.
guess what? If the power goes out and the charger dies,
Right. Well, and that's the other thing too that I think is so interesting too, because like people have different behaviors whenever they've got that type of like instant gratification type of reinforcement that like screens give us, right? And there's not obviously there's no behavior analytic research about this, right? Because like that's not really in our scope of practice to talk about like how screens affect that. But however, like wouldn't it be interesting to see if like screens themselves were like a function? Because it's so interesting to see like that like children will tolerate like literally anything if there's this in front of their faces.
yes.
um Adults are the same way and then distract them from it and there's a challenging behavior to see,
Mhm.
like an adult will be like what, or that I
Yep.
all this is what I also find happens because I know you work most you're like in a preschool kind of setting, is that right?
So I do in-home. So I usually go between like
So
all
you
different
see
houses,
this.
all different ages.
Okay, so you 100% see what I'm about to talk about, which is a caregiver telling you that the behavior happens out of nowhere and that it only happens with them. And when
Oh,
you are at home and you see the caregiver engage, they are not actually engaged with their child. They are engaged with their phones
yes.
while their child is present in the room and they just bark orders at them
Yep.
and then expect their child to comply. Meanwhile, really all the child wants is their attention or their phone. Let's get real. And the caregiver's like, see, this is what I'm talking about. And you're like,
Yep.
there's so much there.
Yep.
this is why, like, here, we're going to scroll down a little bit. This
Mm,
is why the synthesis matters, because what I just described there is that the child was seeking attention plus the escape from the demand,
mhm.
right? So that's why the synthesis of of the function, right? So when we see this kind of multiple like this context of multiple issues going on, you're not going to necessarily always be able to tease out which one is in control at the same time. And they're sometimes just going to shift back and forth.
Mm.
So it's going to look like, no, I don't want to do whatever it was that you just barked at me from doing from behind your phone. And then I'm going to start giggling because you're going to yell at me now, but you're going
Yep.
to put the phone down at least to yell at me.
Yep.
So,
I have so many times I've had to tell parents of like, hey, I'm here, please put your phone down. Or I even had a parent that told me that she couldn't take data at home because she had too much going on. And I said, how often are you on your phone? And she stopped talking. And I went, so while you're on your phone, put the data in the text message and just send it to me. Like you're already on your
yeah,
phone. Just use it. Like,
100%. So this is why the synthesized functional analysis is appropriate. Hey, Felicia, how's your son doing?
hi.
Good. Apparently the medication is working. Seems to be nauseous from drinking it.
Oh.
Oh,
So, and he's got molars coming in that we didn't know. So that's
Ooh.
adding to it. Poor guy.
oh, that's the worst. And
Well,
again, it's
feel
not like
better,
we can tell
buddy.
you this is what's happening.
Okay.
Well, I'm recording it because Trisha also can't join us today. And so I figured, well, this works out. So Felicia, you can see anything that happened in the first 20 minutes.
Awesome.
Um, but I will say we're still on the Cooper article, or Cooper chapter, so you haven't missed much, other than some lively discussion.
Oh,
We essentially have just kind of like gone through like the basics of like, okay, so there's the antecedent, right? Here's what happens when you change something on the front end, and then consequence. And here's what happens when you change something on the back end, right? On the consequence side. But then we were also talking about, and remind me again of what environment you're currently in when it comes to ABA application. None. Sorry, you're muted.
I'm sorry. So I have preschoolers,
Right.
but there's no formal
That's fine.
BCBA or anything like that. So I
Okay.
eventually need to get some training hours in soon, preferably.
Yeah, you do. Do you have a BCBA supervisor?
No.
Ooh, let's get you set up with one. Felicia, I'll email you some people who do supervision.
Okay.
Also, Felicia, not trying to poach or anything, but if you wanted to look at like different fields or different jobs,
Mm-hmm.
I work with BHN and I do in-home stuff. They provide you with BCBAs and supervisors, so that way, like, you don't have to. I think sometimes you have to outsource or pay for them. I could be mistaken. But if like, for example, I get my supervision hours through my company because I work there, so like I have people come out with me and I do supervision and stuff like that. So it might help you money
Oh, so
wise.
it's a win-win.
Yeah. And I can
But
always
yeah,
do
if you want
indirect
to,
supervision with you, but I wouldn't be able to do direct supervision, but I can definitely do like if like office hour supervision, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't have
if
to
you
be
want
during
to,
my office
Felicia, I can
hours.
email you all that
Yeah,
info too.
that would be wonderful.
Perfect. That's awesome.
Awesome. Thank you.
No
Yay.
problem. I'm always looking for fun people to work with me, so
Oh, okay. Definitely. Cool.
And I will say, so, and this would be great because like we were just talking about the home app, like the in-home application. So I've worked in pretty much all of the different environments whenever it comes to the autistic population. So school, in-home, community, and clinic. And yeah, in-home is it's
Is
where the most change happens.
Mhm.
However, it's also where the most frustration happens.
Agreed.
So just be aware. But so
However, I
yeah, go
will
ahead.
say you will make the bestest little friends ever.
100%. You become these people's people.
Mhm.
So we were talking the Cooper chapter really does just kind of give a beautiful overview. And Felicia, I don't know if you had a chance to read it. If not, I highly recommend if there's anything that you do read from today, this one being the thing to read. Because it does just say like, okay, really briefly, with as Stacia pointed out, quite a bit of jargon. Here is what it is in a nutshell. Like this is really like the meat of our science. This is what makes everything kind of click. So like a lot of times I'm sure when you've been working with like your preschoolers, you've seen where you're like, okay, but if I when I just do this, they don't have that behavior, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
But then they do this, right? And then I'm like, yeah, that's so fantastic, right? That's
Hmm.
it. You're now what we're going to talk about is why did that happen? And it's because like that little thing that you modified, that you changed, was either an antecedent, so something that you changed before, or
Hmm.
something that you changed after. And I'm going to be real in my clinical practice, the majority of the time what I find is the most effective with function based interventions are the things that you modify before. So those antecedents are going to be what's going to set your whole teaching process up for success so that then all you're reinforcing are these beautiful adaptive behaviors, right? Whereas opposed to like if I'm trying to differentiate my reinforcement from this kind of like consequence of like, okay, I saw this behavior happen. So I'm going to try to like do some planned ignoring and then they do something slightly different. Then I'd be like, yeah, oh, nope, they went back to it. That's really hard to do. And people always will intermittently, right, reinforce this behavior. So they're going to continue to strengthen it over time without realizing it. So that's why, like, when we think about like the best ways to do it is to really prevent the behavior from happening and then, but teaching ways to progress beyond the need to engage in that behavior to get their wants and their needs met. Does that make sense? Beautiful. And so that's really what this chapter hopefully lays out for everyone. But then the different ways to analyze how to do that and to assess how to do that. So it does go through the functional analysis procedures. And I was telling Stasia, one of the things that I love about this in particular is if we look here at the bottom of this page is conducting functional analyses in natural settings. So in the preschool environment, in the home environment, and that's primarily where I have found the most success with doing these functional analyses. Because when you do them in these types of environments, you have less control, which is not always great. However, you do then have more of an ability then to not, this is going to sound awful, but this is really kind of my clinical opinion. You're not then holding that child captive to these conditions in a confined space without the ability to escape, right? So when we think about, and this is going into ethics, so keep this in mind, y'all. When we think about assent, do y'all know what assent means? So, no. So, think consent, right? But that's the verbal agreement. Assent, ASSENT, is a non-verbal agreement to participate and to agree to continue to participate. So, if a learner's trying to get out of that room, they're no longer assenting. And if they could verbally consent, and sometimes they do say, no, get me out, um, they're no longer agreeing to that type of procedure, right? That type of experiment that's happening. But if you're in the natural setting, you cannot control if they get out of that. You're not going to, you can't hold them into this space. So, in my clinical opinion, and I always try to be really clear about that. In my clinical opinion, it's the most ethical way to conduct these types of analyses. Because again, you're then able to get the learner to assent and withdraw their assent and honoring that. And that's actually part of our code of ethics as well, y'all. So just be aware of that as we move through this, because that's going to come up quite a bit. So if a kiddo is not assenting to something, then you can say it's escape maintained, sure, but we also have to make sure what other environmental contingencies are in play. Beautiful. Okay, so we talked briefly as you were coming on, Felicia, and we haven't gotten into it yet. We talked a little bit about synthesized functional analyses. And that's when, again, talking about the context, right? What's going on in the environment. So we set up this kind of example of, let's say that you're in an in-home situation, and I'm sure you've actually seen this in public, in all honesty, and that's a mom or a caregiver on their phone, literally barking a demand or an order at their kid, and then yelling at their kid who didn't comply with that demand. Meanwhile, the caregiver's still kind of on their phone, but then the child starts laughing or engaging in another behavior that really ticks the caregiver off. Caregiver finally puts away their phone, then they're yelling at their kid. Picked him up. All right, that's it. So I've seen it. I've seen it in parking lots. I've seen it in grocery stores. I've seen it in the homes where I work. And there are multiple contingencies going on, right? Because not only is that kiddo trying to escape this type of possible demand that the parents barking at them, but they also are desperate for that attention too. So we've got two functions of behavior happening at the same time. We have this need for attention, we have this need to escape the demand, and they're going to fight between which one's going to have the most control over the behavior, right? That's what we talk about when we talk about controlling the behavior. It's not about controlling a person, it's about what contingency is controlling that behavior. So it's going to fight back and forth between attention and escape. If I'm getting more for the escape, that's what I'm going to do more of. If I'm getting more for the attention, that's what I'm going to do more of. Whichever, it's going to keep happening though, until we address it and we address the underlying function. And when we think about synthesized functional analyses, we have to do both then at the same time. We're going to address both the attention and the escape at the exact same time. So that's something to think about there. And then we'll talk about what that looks like whenever we're like addressing both of them at the same time, whenever we really get into the ISCA and PFA, which I love. But at the same time, it's not always appropriate because sometimes like it is 100% one function and you're just like, wow. I have a girl who everybody's like, I don't know. Sometimes I think it's escape. And I'm like, okay, who's with her? And they're like, well, it was a new person. I'm like, there you go. Where was the person who's known her the best? She was working with a different client. Mm-hmm. And did that person have to come in to address this escalated behavior? Well, yeah. Did it turn off after she gave her a little bit of attention? Yeah. Oh, well, there you go. It's attention. 100% attention. So like that's how, because this girl too, like I love her to death. She will do, this sounds awful to say, but she'll do like hours of work if she's getting quality one-on-one attention. And when I say work, I mean like she goes through a full school day of like, okay, math timings, reading timings, lunch break, art, staying on topic the entire time. This is all embedded with like ACT programming and AIM stuff. And she's just like, all right, let's do it. And as long as there's quality one-on-one attention, she's great. But if you take away any sort of attention whatsoever, skyrocketing behavior. It's really interesting. Really, really interesting.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
So when it is because kind of talking about my kiddo that I was telling you about with like the mom situation, I had a kiddo that was at my other company I worked at that had the same issue, but it was to a degree that it was like self-injurious behavior up like the wall. Like,
Yes.
I mean, insane. So in that situation, like when they want attention to a point where is it like inhibiting on her education or anything, or like the task that she's supposed to do? So would you have to kind of wean that off? Like if she's able to kind of have like small spurts of no attention, but she's still able to kind of stay on task, like is that something that you could put in for a
Oh, I see what
kiddo?
you're saying. So,
Yeah.
um, so this one in particular, uh, what we have found is that no, we have not been able to wean any sort of attention from her. Um, well, I take that back. So what we've done, like we can divert our attention for several minutes at a time as long as she has some sort of alternative activity and again, like outside of like the iPad, right? So some
Mhm.
sort of alternative activity that she has chosen, like self-elected to engage in. But usually we still have to provide intermittent reinforcement of like
Okay.
praise and attention during that activity, just to continue that going. But like
Mhm.
some things that we've done is like really signaled with that antecedent of saying like, okay, so let's say it's 2:50, her session ends in 10 minutes. I'm going to say I have to finish writing my session note. So that means that for the last 10 minutes, I'm not going to be able to be one-on-one with you, but
Mhm.
I'm still with you. Now, tell me some ways that you know that I'm still with you. And she'll say things like, well, you're sitting next to me. And I'll be like, yeah, okay, what else? And she'll say, okay, even if you're writing my note, I know that it's about me because you care about me. And like, yes, excellent. Okay, now give me one more thing. Um, you are going to talk about all of the good things that we did together today. Yes. And then that's usually what I'll put in her note too. And I'll like after I type like um Jay had engaged in X, Y, and Z activities with zero problem behaviors. And I'll
Mhm.
say that out loud and I'll be like, yes, isn't that right? Right. And like, she'll be like, yes, right. And so like she's still contacting some of that reinforcement, but we are like weaning is still like
I
how
like that idea though. I never thought of like talking to them where you're like, "Oh, how do you know that I'm still in this area?" I'm actually gonna write that down. Thank you.
well, and
Because
she's very verbal. So she's also 17. She just turned 17. So she's older. And
yeah,
I've worked with her now for 9 years.
because I
Uh,
have a 6-year old that's very
yeah.
attention based, and I feel like sometimes I kind of have to sit her down and like talk to her so that it kind of processes. So I have to kind of like
Yes.
sit with her. So I think that would actually be a good idea because usually when I bounce like a question off of her, like, oh, like how, because usually she'll look at me and she's like, "Am I doing this right?" And usually I'll be like, "But I wanted to try to like wean
I'm going to
off of
fade
the
that. Yeah.
asking me that," and I go, "How do you like? How would you
Problem
think
solving.
that's right? Like, do you think it's right? How about you look at the picture? Does it look like the same?" And
Well,
that's
and
when she'll usually go, "Oh, okay," and then she'll switch like whatever she was doing,
yes.
and
Well, and this is also a great opportunity too for that kind of differential reinforcement that you were talking about earlier. So instead of like always providing a smile, you might not every time and make it a little bit more intermittent so that maybe she does like go back and check it again. And maybe then she's like, okay, I am right. And she might look at you still kind of like, why didn't you give me the praise? Like I was right. And then
yeah.
you can praise her, right? Because then she actually self-checked it instead of
Mhm.
waiting for that. Because like essentially what could happen with that kind of like waiting for the smile is then the prompt dependency builds in.
Yep.
Because then you'll find that like that skill might not be there. But then if they look at you and you're smiling, then they're like, okay, then that was right.
That's why usually now I'm like this while she's doing it, and I'll like write notes down while she's doing it, and then I feel her eyes look at me, and I'm like, oh no, don't look at, don't
Mm-hmm.
look at, and then I'll kind of do like intermittent, like little kind of looking over, like seeing how she's doing, and then
Yeah. And you
usually when
might just
she
be like, hey,
finishes,
just
I'm like,
go
good
back and check
job, like
that
you did
one. Yeah.
great.
Yeah, exactly. Um, Beautiful. Okay, so so the latency-based functional analysis, we're going to actually read an article about latency-based FAs. I love latency-based FAs because, again, like they're one of those things, like let's say that it's not a behavior that happens that often, but you kind of want to see, like, is it more of like a tolerance window? And that's why we're seeing this behavior happen. So like we have a kiddo who we did a latency-based FA with, and we essentially, what we did was we'd already conducted an FA to know that it was escape. So we're like, all right, so there is escape from demand. That is what we're dealing with here. However, it's not every demand that is evoking this behavior. So now we really have to do some more digging, some more analysis to figure out what types of demands are evoking this behavior. So we did a latency-based FA with him, and we did it. I'll never forget this one. We did like 10 trials of like all of these different demands. And then when we got to verbal demands, the very first one evoked the behavior. And we're like, oh, well, I guess we know what it is there. So it was so clear. And that's, again, this is our science. This is why when people like kind of like naysay on our science, like go back to this, because this is actually why our science matters. It's not about the pigeons and reinforcement. It's about this. Like when we can pinpoint that, oh my God, it's not every demand. It's verbal demands. If I am doing this Q&A and expecting him to parrot back a response, I'm going to get punched in the face. Noted. So that's what it was. Like there was no precursor. It was just straight to the noggin. So I was like, all right, we're good. But that's what the science tells us. So that, again, like we can make antecedent modifications so that I'm not going to present those types of demands to this kid. However, I'm not always going to prevent other people from placing those types of demands. So how am I going to get him to tolerate these? So we did a lot of shaping, right? We did a lot of different antecedent interventions that had to do with presenting non-vocal demands, so written demands, and then shaping that behavior. Anyway, we can go to more of that later. And we talk about interventions at the end. But I did, yeah, go ahead, Stasia.
I'm just gonna go feed the cat because she is like meowing like crazy.
Go for it. Felicia, do you have any questions about latency-based FAs? Cool. So I talked a little bit about this too, this next little paragraph about the functional analysis of precursors. So precursors, when I said there were no precursors and it was just like a punch in the face, typically there is a tell, right? There's a little behavior that changes, and what we can do is just measure that. And that's a lot of what I like to do. I like to live in this world of just measuring the precursor. And that is because you don't have to push the learner to punching you in the face to find out what the function of the behavior is. And if you are continuously doing this for the sake of data, it's really pretty harmful to the learner. And so again, going back to our code of ethics, we've got to think about the underlying do no harm. And if we are pushing learners to these types of extreme behaviors, that's over time going to create a pretty big issue and create a great deal of harm. So that's also why we talk about those safety considerations. And we won't talk about these a ton today because we're going to talk about them more whenever we go through the risk benefit analysis closer towards the end of the semester. But really, ultimately, always thinking about assent withdrawal, and the safety of the learner. Okay, so descriptive FAs or descriptive FBAs are essentially ABC data. So have you ever seen something that looks like this, other than in the book that we're reading?
A little.
Yeah. So these are like, a lot of times, like you might see these like as a checklist, or sometimes it's just going to be the boxes where they say like what happened before, what was the behavior, and what happened after. Um, and that's typically like how a lot of clinics will do it whenever we're first setting up with a client, because we really don't know. We've talked to the caregivers and we found out some information. We've got a little bit of a hypothesis, but we haven't observed anything yet. And so what we'll do then is put in this type of data sheet so that they can say like, okay, so I had to talk to the RBT who was over here or the teacher who was over here. And as soon as I did, they swiped all of the materials off of the table. So I'm going to say that I'm going to check my attention was diverted. I'm going to say that the behavior, it's not listed here, but I'm going to say it was, they swiped property destruction, right? Or they swiped items from the table. And then the consequence, well, what did I do? Well, I ended up having them restore the environment. So that would probably fall under reprimand. And then I would also put in like the task demand in there as well, right? Let's pick everything up. Or I might have diverted my attention further, right? And then more likely that behavior escalated further. And then you can see that it's like it might then go on to something else where you'd be like, oh man, now I've got a new behavior that I've got to track. So what happened? Okay, so attention was still diverted. Now we've got that they are aggressing towards other kids. So I'm going to score aggression. And now I'm going to say attention has now been provided. They've been given a reprimand. Um, Everything else has been removed, right? Tasks have been removed, everything's been removed. So then that doesn't necessarily give us a very clear picture, right? Like my story gave us a lot, but if I were to just look at the data or just said attention diverted, swiped items like property destruction, and then I just said attention diverted again, and then attention diverted, and then aggression, and then reprimand, I don't necessarily know what's going on here because what if while my attention was diverted, he had also been given a pretty large task to do and was doing fine on that task whenever I was providing praise and one-on-one attention. But as soon as I diverted my attention, they stopped and then they swiped. And then we removed the task too. Plus, I provided a reprimand. What is it? This is why sometimes like this data might not give us enough information to make a determination of what's truly the function of the behavior. Go for it.
So when I was doing ABC sheets, I have I have feelings about the checklist one. I think mainly because
Yeah.
I wish I had some. If I had some, I would show you, but I had like old ABC sheets where we would do there would be boxes, but they're blank. So basically what we would write is whatever was happening before in that setting. So that way we knew in this environment, this specific thing happened, this specific behavior happened. Let's say attention was diverted, so I had a kid that would climb on stuff and jump off. So it was very unsafe behavior because he would
Mhm.
jump off of very tall things,
It's
and
always it's like the least safe of all behaviors ever for
yes.
attention.
And then of course you had to write. I wrote exactly what I did afterwards, and then I would even write a little blurb of like how like the recoil after the entire thing. So like this entire thing happened. How was the aftermath? So I would write it out so
So
that way BCBAs were doing the program, they could be like, oh, I didn't even know these behaviors were there because of XYZ, because mom didn't even notice them. And I was like, yeah, this is what's specifically
so
happening.
that's exactly what, okay, so you're kind of describing now what would be a narrative recording. So you've got this ABC narrative recording, and that's exactly what you're describing here. And I'm going to be real, that's a higher level skill than what most people are starting out at. So congratulations, Stasia. We talk often about like, well, we've got to reduce the response effort for the data collector. And that's where things like this happen. But to what risk, right? Well, the risk is that you're not getting all of the data. So you've got to put in these types of like narratives, usually to fill in the story. A lot of times, what the argument that a lot of behavior analysts will make is that there is often unobservable things that are often put into the narrative. So if you look here, like they felt embarrassed or they were frustrated. So that's really just somebody who doesn't necessarily know how to write observationally might describe something. So another thing that we might say, instead of saying like felt embarrassed, we might say diverted, put their head down, their face turned red, and they said, I don't want to talk about it. We're going to give the observation around, I feel embarrassed, right? And that's how we would do the narrative of the recording. So I love that, Stasia, because that's exactly what that does. Is it just gives more information around the context of like, okay, so this is why he's climbing and jumping off of high surfaces. It's not just for when this happens, it's when your attention is here specifically. And that's that's what I'm able to figure out here. Yeah.
Another thing too, because I had like a couple of peers that would also like ask me because I worked in a daycare setting, like because sometimes I go to daycare, sometimes I go to homes. It kind of just
Yeah.
depends on where the kid was at. But I was in a daycare with one of my coworkers, and she also does not like the checklist one because sometimes she's like, but what if that's not the antecedent that happens? Or what if that's not the behavior that happens? Then do I just not record it? And I was like, no, you record it. I
Record
said, if the antecedent isn't what's in the check boxes, I go, I always write it on the side.
always.
Even if the antecedent is there, I will even write what environment I'm in just so because I know kids in different environments. My kiddo is great in daycare, but then when she gets home, it's like all odds are out the window. So like there's all different types of things that go into it. So that's why I tell
Yes.
people like write down your where you're at too, because environments change and behaviors change based off of where they are.
Well, and that's the other thing too. So when you look at this, like, so at the top it says like, okay, what this is, who's taking the data, the time it ended, the date. But I would always, like what you were just saying, I would say what classroom I was in. I would say what other people were around. I would say if this was in the lunchroom, right? Like there, all of these things that I would say, like what peers were around with their initials, all of that kind of data is data that you can eventually codify and quantify. And that's essentially what you can get here. So if you can quantify the data and say, like, okay, so how many times was the behavior present versus how many times was it absent? That's what the present and absent means right there. Now what I can do is I can put that on a graph and I can say, like, oh, okay, well, there's a high probability that it's going to happen whenever this attention component is happening, whenever there's the contingency of attention. So that's why the more information we have, the better. Because then what we can do is we can say, like, okay, but like specifically, it's when these peers are here, or specifically, it's when this caregiver is present. And we are creatures who contact reinforcement easily. And so like we're going to continue to engage in those patterns of behavior that contact reinforcement. Um, okay, so scatter plot recording is a great thing to kind of figure out if there's something that might be happening with the time of day. So again, when we're talking about the context, some behaviors might happen more frequently in the morning. Some might happen more frequently at lunch because we're hangry. Some may happen more frequently right before dinner because we might be getting tired or we've reached that threshold, right? So that's why scatter plot data is actually really beneficial. Um, However, it doesn't really tell us the full story, right? This tells us like, okay, so I can see that it's clustered more at this time of day versus it actually looks like it's really clustered toward meals. So like what I was just saying, probably they're hungry. Just kidding. But that could be some information that you can gather from scatterplot data. Scatterplot data can also be really helpful for caregivers who don't like to take data because it's really easy. But I'll be real, it's also the easiest for caregivers just to fill in a couple of random plots before you get there because I've walked in on caregivers doing that before. Just FYI. Data can be fabricated if there is no IOA, right? So if there's nobody agreeing with you taking that data, what does it matter?
Or if they're on their phone, they can just text you the data.
Yeah, that's so, yeah, yep. Okay,
Hey, and guess what? She ended up texting me the data the next week.
there you go.
So,
So this next thing is actually what we're going to be doing next week, which are the behavioral interviews. And so we're going to do the QABF and we're going to do the FAST together. They're both really quick interviews, but these would be the interview that you conduct with a caregiver prior to anything else, which is really something to think about whenever we're talking about the entire FBA process. So speaking of the entire FBA process. This is our goal for today. So what I would go ahead and grab just a sheet of paper, or if you want to do it on like a Google sheet or whatever, or a Google Doc, that's fine, whatever is most comfortable for you. Go ahead and create this type of task analysis for somebody or some bodies that you're thinking about potentially using for your project for this semester. So I always have a couple of learners who are like constantly on my mind. Those would be the ones that I would think of. Or maybe there's one where you're like, I really don't know what causes this behavior. I don't know. I'd love to figure this one out. Um, Go ahead and we'll put that down. So like we're focusing on this section right here where it's just conducting a functional behavioral assessment or behavior assessment. So the first thing, we're going to gather the information that we need. We're going to do this with interviewing the caregiver. Or if we don't have access to the caregiver because it's in a preschool setting, interviewing the teacher, or a one-on-one who spends a lot of time with this kid. Then I'm going to do a little bit of an observation. So this kind of descriptive assessment that Stasia was talking about earlier, where you're going to write down as much information as you possibly can. And then you're still going to categorize what happens before with the antecedent. You're still going to categorize the behavior, and you're still going to categorize what happens after. So that ABC, but you're going to add as much information and all of that as you possibly can. Then, so like this is already, I have 2 steps to my task analysis. This is my task analyses are individualized. So I already have 2 steps on my task analysis where they just have 1. That's fine. Whatever makes sense to you. That's why we're doing it ourselves. Then I get really in depth with these types of things. And so that's when I start finding word trends and I start codifying things. And that's how I interpret information from indirect and descriptive assessments. You don't have to go that deep, especially if you're going to do something like the QABF and the FA and the FAST, like we're going to do next week. It's going to tell you pretty much everything that you're going to need to know anyway about the potential hypothesis. So that's fine. There's a reason why I go so deep, and it's because most of the time, by the time kids get to me, they're no longer early learners. There's some major learning histories going on, and it is some complex shit. So that's why I get really in depth. And then I'll like call the caregiver and be like, okay, do you remember during the interview and you mentioned very briefly that grandma visited in December of 2019? Talk to me about what happened during that visit, because I have to find out like why is it on December 19th every single year that we're seeing the same thing. And it's because, oh, well, I forgot to tell you, her grandmother died in December. There we
it's
go.
internal.
There we go. But that's not what this class is about. So don't worry.
Yeah.
So then you're going to interpret that data that the caregivers have given you and that you've gotten from the FAST or the QABF. And you're going to say like, oh, okay, based on everything they just said, I'm going to hypothesize that we've got this for the function. So develop a hypothesis, but now you're going to test your hypothesis. So once I've figured out what I think it might be, I'm going to have to actually do our science, what sets us apart from everything else. I'm going to test to see if it is truly attention, to see if it is truly escape from demand, to see if it is truly access to tangibles. And Felicia, you missed this at the beginning, but I was telling Stacia, I was like, with the exception of the iPad, because, or a screen or a phone, like the access to those types of tangibles, that's on a totally different level often, right? Like that should be like its own function in itself sometimes. So like I would say like, is it truly access to tangibles or is it access to the phone or iPad? Yeah. Is it access to YouTube Kids? So then you're going to test this hypothesis. And you're going to choose one of those many things that we're going to go through each and every class about what's going to make the most sense for how you're going to test it. Are you going to do a latency based FA? Are you going to do a trial based FA? Are you just going to, and Stacia, this was just as you were feeding Rosie, are you just going to do the one for precursors? Yes. And the reason for that is just because of the risks and the harm. Are you going to do it to where it's trial based? I don't know. We have to figure this out. And you're the only one who's going to be able to make that determination because you're the one who knows the learner best. But we're going to talk about it and we're going to talk through it and we're going to see why is this what that makes the most sense? Or is it the one that makes the most sense? And then you're going to develop an intervention based on the function of the behavior that also then addresses adaptive skills. Cool. So that's essentially what it looks like. And then I would say there are check-ins that happen after that to make sure it's still working. And then you also might even decide, like, should this be a synthesized issue? Like, should I work on a synthesis as opposed to a single function? And that's also something to think about, especially if you're doing this in the natural environment and you're like, ooh, we've got multiple contingencies to play with. Okay. So really the rest of Cooper talks about, or the rest of this little section really talks about the bulk of what we're going to be breaking down in the class, which is fantastic. So again, I think that this type of overview is really, really good and important. It also breaks down the different types. So there are case studies that will go through like what it looks like to go through a brief FA, which a brief FA, same thing as an experimental FA, but instead of having these contingencies where you're holding a learner into the cell for 10 minutes or 20 minutes, you're only doing it for 5 minutes. So again, still about assent. We're still thinking about assent withdrawal. Does the learner have the ability to leave this space? I don't know. We have to think about this whenever it comes to what we're choosing for what's going to be most appropriate for your case. And then it also breaks down trial-based FAs. But what I love about it is that it goes through how they developed an intervention, right? And what it looks like. I love that it also didn't just choose like some pretty basic behaviors, but I mean, I will say, so Elijah, like, I don't know if you read this case study, his behavior is elopement. That is one of the most challenging behaviors to try to address because of the safety involved and the fact is when you're in a school setting, a lot of times you can't do run stops, which means that you can't prevent them from leaving the door, leaving the facility. And so there are legal ramifications to consider whenever you're thinking about elopement. That's why it's a very challenging behavior to try to address. And what's interesting is that this kid in this case is 9 years old. That's old, right? To be trying to address this type of behavior. Yeah. So it's interesting to see the interventions and how they work. I will say that in my experience, DRIs are pretty much the most effective when it comes to elopements or other types of self-harm types of behaviors and self-injurious behaviors, just FYI. And then, So going into the evaluating of the precursor behavior, this is where I typically have a tendency to live. And this is because if I've gone through the caregiver's interview and they've told me what the magnitude of the behavior is, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't need to see self-injurious head banging to the point of contusions. I'm going to take your word on it, right? I'm going to take your word for this one. I'm going to evaluate what happens when he's in vocal protest because that's the precursor to the self-injurious behavior. And that's because that's going to prevent harm. It's going to prevent a head contusion, right? So that's usually why I live in precursor land. Sometimes with younger learners, there is not a lot of precursor. It is really fast, right? Yeah. Felicia, how old is your son? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you've been through it, you know.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Still, sometimes.
Still, it's that fast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually did put a note for this will
Yeah.
for that little section right there. I didn't know that they could put kids like that in juvie,
Yeah.
like juvenile detention center. That's awful.
So
I was reading it and I'm like, I'm sorry. And I went back and I read it again and I'm like, I did read juvenile detention
this is
center.
what
And
I
I was
need
like,
you to understand right now. And hold on, I'm going to stop the recording for just a second. Okay. With our current administration, you're going to see a lot more of this.
oh, it's
With our current administration, we are. So everything that
that
I'm
breaks
saying
my
right now
heart
is
because they're
under
not
the
even
impression that like
getting.
nothing has changed.
Yeah,
But please keep in mind, a lot of what I'm saying in throughout this course might change because of our current administration. We're the next article that we're going to read is about schools. Everything that I'm talking about in that school, as
Yeah.
of today, does not matter. But we're going to pretend that it does.
yeah.
So, yes, kids with IDD, autistic children, other neurodivergent children are 100% in juvenile detention centers right now. They
That's
will be,
awful.
there will be more of them. And those juvenile detention centers will no longer be government backed. They are going to be privately run, just like the privately funded presence that we have now. Okay.
No.
Sorry. That is where we are. And on that note, yeah, so they can be in juvenile detention centers. There is one here in Pikes Peak or in Colorado Springs called Zebulon Pike, and quite a few of their detainees, their inmates, are autistic or somewhere on the spectrum or with severe intellectual disabilities. So this is why actually applied behavior analysis and early intervention does matter.
Mm.
Because if we can teach adaptive skills and pro-social behaviors to these children, such as communication, we can prevent aggression, verbal outbursts, and urinating on people to get their wants and needs met, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. So, and this is also why this part of our science is so crucial, because getting to the root of it is going to make it faster so that that change is more effective and long lasting and more efficient. Cool.
But I
Okay. Oh, go ahead,
some of you-
Felicia. Oh, Felicia. I didn't, yeah, go ahead.
I find that some of the parents are not as proactive. Like when you say, I feel like I see certain things and we should address it and get assistance, parents are like, no, he's okay. We're just gonna wait it out. And I'm like, listen, even if you get a label for a little while.
That's the thing. People are very afraid right now of labels. And I think part of it is because of what we just
Yeah.
talked about slightly off of the record, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is here. We're gonna go into the expanding best practices for assessment for students with ID. Um, because that's exactly what has been one of the issues, especially with schools, is saying like, hey, this is what I'm seeing. And here's the possibility of what could happen. Because the reality is, and this is what the Snyder et al. Article talks about, is that there's a lot of bureaucracy just to get a kid tested, just to get a kid assessed and evaluated. But the first step is somebody like you, like a teacher or behavior analyst saying, hey, I'm noticing this to the parents. And the parents then have to say, yes, let's do this evaluation. And what I have experienced too, Felicia, is that if there's a caregiver who is resistant to this, the behavior problems exponentially increase. And then what happens is that the school eventually has a meeting where they say, I cannot manage this learner's behaviors anymore. But because there's nothing that's legally making me keep this student here, I can suspend them or expel them.
I
And
think
that's
we
what ends up happening. And then that parent ends up having to homeschool their child if they're capable. Otherwise, though, they're still listed as homeschooling them.
Hmm.
So there is a lot going on, to say the least, when it comes to that type of like fear of diagnosis. But I would say, kind of like what Stasia was saying earlier, your child's going to receive a label, whether it's a formal diagnosis or a label from his peers or her peers or their peers, saying they're difficult. I don't want to be their friend. They're weird. Well, cool. What would you rather? Like my son would much rather tell people that he's got ADHD than somebody to say like that was weird. He'd be like, yeah, it's my ADHD, right? And they'd be like, oh, okay, that's not that weird. That's a lot easier to deal with, right? But there is this thought process of like, well, if they had the diagnosis, they're going to get worse. It's
Hmm.
it's it's a social stigma, in all honesty, and unfortunate. Um, and that's honestly, in my opinion, what comes to light a lot in this article right here, the Snyder et al. And that is, let's go through all of the stuff that you have to do in order to assess a student in school. And Felicia, we just talked about this, and it talks about this in the abstract, but students with IDD frequently interface with school psychologists during the evaluation process. They continue to face significantly poorer post-school outcomes and family school partnerships with their peers within and outside of special education. And that is because they don't have that support in their community. And part of it is because maybe they didn't receive a diagnosis in time. Maybe it's because they didn't find their community in time. But our need to belong is innate, right? And
Mhm.
when we don't have the supports in place, which starts with the assessment process. So if we don't have the support in place from the beginning, then we're just going to be constantly trying to like fill in the gaps for these
Mhm.
kids until they become adults. And then there's just too much of a strain, right? To where there's no strong foundation keeping them afloat. Yeah. Um, and I'm not one of those like we have to do 40 hours a week early intervention services. No, but we do have to provide enough supports and services early on from a full wraparound holistic approach, in order to have the best possible outcomes for these kids for the sake of their own mental health, if anything else. Plus, not to mention what it does for those caregivers. Did either of you read this article? You did? Cool. What were your thoughts on it, Stasia?
So I actually really I was kind of nitpicking a little bit through it about when I loved that they kept talking about collaboration. I love how many times that word was used throughout
Mm-hmm.
the article because I actually wrote a paper last semester about the importance of it because I tell parents all the time that I am not one to judge. I am open to literally whatever you're telling me. I just need open communication about Is the things that I'm telling you and my BCBA is telling you to do, are they working? Are they not working? Do you have a better way of going about it? Is there a new problem that arisen? And if so, what's going on? Because something I've noticed is there's not enough communication between each stakeholder with the
Mhm.
child, that it's like we're wondering, oh, actually, I'll use an example with my kid with the banana peel thing I was
Yeah.
describing to you. Her school has all of these crazy behaviors that have suddenly come out, and we're like, why are we not being notified? But mom's coming home with all of this info that, oh, she did this, that, and the third, but we have no antecedents. We don't know what's going on afterwards. We've told them multiple times to reach out to us. So when mom's telling me this, then I'm emailing them going, hey, heard this happened at school.
Yeah.
We're not seeing this at home. What's going on? Like, we've had to do it with school. We've had to do it with even her doctors too, because we've noticed her doctor is like the biggest trigger on the planet. Like, it is, she needs her whole family at the doctor's office. It's
Wow.
bad. Like that, and the dentist, she just had a dental procedure. It took 6 people to get her to have the anesthetic, because she
Yeah.
had to get like things like pulled out. And we always wonder, like, okay, well, what triggered that behavior? Like, what were you guys doing? Because this doesn't ever happen. Like, is it, obviously, yes, it's the environment. She knows that she's getting a procedure done. She's at the doctor. She sees that. But we also notice too, it's the staffing. I know staffing is hard, but usually she's more receptive to female versus male staff. And they put that in her chart, but she had all male staff last time. And we're like, why is this not
Understood.
being
Yeah.
communicated?
Yeah.
Like,
Wow. Yeah. So you're exactly right. So that type of partnership and communication and lack thereof. And that's again part of the assessment process. So without that information, you can't truly help. You can't provide an intervention or a helpful tool to prevent that from happening in the future without knowing, like, well, should be an all-female staff. And then they'll say, well, we can't schedule around that way. Okay, cool. Well, you need to make sure that there's a female present that they feel safe and
yeah.
comfortable with so we can do some operant conditioning, right? Oh, hey, babe.
Or even the other thing is maybe she just goes in just to meet the staff and it's not
Yes.
this big to do.
Exactly.
I actually like that you brought that up, Felicia, because something that we've tried telling the school multiple times, because they change staff like nobody's business. But they know when they're changing staff, which is what bothers me the most. They usually have like a week or two where they know that this is what's
Yeah.
going to happen. So we've told them, hey, if staff is changing, if you're already having these people come in and meet all of the kids, can you notify us so that we can come in the school, do a proper stimulus control transfer, so that way she knows that, okay, yes, this was my teacher, but now we're slowly integrating the other teacher and fading the other one out. So that way, when that transition happens,
It's
we're
not
not seeing
blindsided.
a
Yeah.
spike. Yeah, because when that happens, we're like, oh, she did 90 backflaps today, 17 SIBs, like, and I'm like, what happened? And they're
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, we changed staff 2 weeks ago. I'm like,
I didn't think it was
thanks
that
for
big of a
telling me.
And
deal.
it's almost like they are hurting themselves because now you have to deal with this rather than saying, hey, come in and help us.
I'll be
And
100%.
right
we
back.
It's
Yeah.
reactive instead of proactive. And
right.
that's also, I think, why people get irritated with us because we're like, right, but how did you not see where you went wrong with this type of situation where you just brought in new staff? I know it's really interesting the way like a lot of adults forget about
Hmm.
their impact on the environment, and which is consequently the impact on the behavior, right?
Yeah.
They're like, I've got a huge problem for you to fix. And it's not, it's really just, y'all probably should have told the kid, you've got a new teacher. There's going to be somebody new with you tomorrow instead of
Yeah.
just surprising them with it. Um, okay. So I liked this article too, because I think that it's really in depth with like the behind the scenes. So like all of the assessments that can happen before even the observation with the learner happens too. So the ecological assessment, so like determining like, okay, so what type of environment is best for their learning, Where are they seeing, like, where are they developmentally? All of those types of assessments are important too, with knowing like how to best address with interventions, especially in the school setting. And I apologize. I'm going to shut the door real quick because my kids had a snow day today and they're all starting to go a little stir crazy. So give me one sec.
I'm jealous.
Hey, I will say, as much as I would be jealous, I'm also not because I'm good with the snow right now.
Yeah, the snow and
I'm
I
all
are,
set with that. I don't
I'm
want to
good.
brush off my car. I'm good.
And we
How
weren't
much
even
did you
supposed
guys
to
get?
really get snow today. And so I'm just like, okay, it's good.
Did
We
you
woke
get
up
a
to
lot?
6 inches.
Oh,
Um, yeah.
Oh,
Okay. Um, yeah, and so I like this article a lot just because I think it goes in a little bit more in depth, especially with what you have to deal with going into schools. Stasia, what were some of the other things that you found with this article?
so I mainly was looking at that. I also liked how it was talking about student self-efficacy because I feel like that's not harped on enough.
Hmm.
I feel like there's, for example, again with that kiddo, she primarily uses an AAC, and she slowly is integrating verbals. So like we have words, but not enough to be like a functional sentence. So like she can mand for certain things, but usually if she's like trying to get a whole point across, she'll usually use her AAC. Um, so what I've been trying to tell her teachers, stop speaking for her.
Yeah.
That is the biggest problem I've noticed in schools is these kids aren't able to speak their own mind. Even if they're not able to speak, they still have a voice, regardless of whether they're able to speak or use an AAC or a PEX or whatever they're using. The problem that I see a lot is teachers are saying, oh, they feel this, or oh, they're doing that, or oh, they said this. And I'm like, no, they say that specifically, or did they say it on their AAC? Did they point on a PEX board? Are they indicating it in some way that you've seen behavioral wise? Um, and 9 times out of 10, they're like, oh, and I'm like, exactly.
Yeah.
If you were in that position, how would you feel if somebody was just speaking for you and you're kind of just, you don't know if you're getting their needs met. And then guess what? A behavior happens and you're like, what happened? It's because you're not allowing that child to advocate for themselves or even like um something I actually have been doing a lot of research on is menstrual cycles in
Yeah.
young ladies on the spectrum because my kiddo is 14 and she's not able to really indicate her pain levels all the time. So she'll be in excruciating pain. And usually I've been with her for 2 years, so I can tell when she's
Hmm.
about to hit it because I notice her behaviors are kind of off a little bit. They're kind of spiking. I'm like, are we in pain? And usually that's when I bring out the pain scale. I bring out like the body thing where she like points and indicates, oh, I'm in pain here. That way she can tell me, oh, I have a pain level of 9. I'm about to throw myself because I'm like
Hmm.
all discombobulated. So usually we're trying to get her to use Tylenol. It's hit or miss because she's very picky about what goes in her body, which I mean is fine. We're still figuring it out, but it's that being able to let her communicate because another thing too is when she is on her menstrual cycle, school is also not helping her nearly as much as they should be and not asking her these things because they know like one of her one-on-ones has like a schedule. So they'll know like when she's close. So usually around that time, I will email them and say, "Hey, have we brought up the pain scale to her lately? How has she indicated her pain? Has she
Hmm.
pointed to it on a body scale? Is she doing her receptives with bot cuz what we're doing now too is doing her body parts receptively so that way she can say like, "Oh, I'm in pain here, 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 whatever."
Yeah.
But like at least allowing her to say that because if not, then they're telling us, oh, well, she flopped and had a bunch of self-injurious behaviors today. And I'm like, why? And they're like, oh, we don't know. And I'm like,
Yeah.
it's,
I know it is, and it is really interesting. Um, and but putting the person in the center of it, like with the self-efficacy, is really important. You're exactly right.
mhm,
Um, and that it can feel difficult to do that with somebody who doesn't communicate as fluently as adults often do, especially teachers. And so it is important to just kind of redirect ideas back to that learner. And this is something, again, that's pretty commonly spoken about is just voting with your feet. If the learner is walking away from that assessment, then they're letting you know they're not ready to continue with this assessment right now. That's part of their self-efficacy. And honoring that during the assessment process is really important because then that's going to establish the trust that's going to allow for intervention to actually happen. So all of these are parts of the framework that are recommended by NASP. So for the Association for School Psychologists. So making sure that you're going through the ecological assessments of not only just talking to the caregivers about the function of the behavior with the FAST and the QABF, but then also going through a little bit like of those values, like, well, what are your goals as a family? What do you envision for your child throughout the process within ABA? What do you envision for the process within their school life? What are your hopes and dreams for your child, right? Because you do want to understand that like that's that underlying motivation that's going to help this horrible word that I hate, but it's going to help that the caregiver buy in so that they do have an understanding of why they're doing this. It's not just about their learner, it's about that full family unit, that ecological unit. And then again, not just choosing one testing thing to test, right? But you're also looking at like multiple components that are going to be addressing this learner's skills and not just their weaknesses and where you're going to have to address. But there's a really important reason to do strengths-based assessments, and that's because you're going to need behavioral momentum to get you through some of these tougher moments, right? So let's say that there is a kid who doesn't like washing their hands, but with behavioral momentum, they at least have this skill and they can rub their hands together. That's amazing. That's a strong skill that we're going to use to shape the skill of washing hands. Does that make sense? Cool. And then therapeutic. So going back to what Stasia was talking about earlier, not dismissing the learner or the student or the person at the center of this behavior change, but collaborating with them, honoring their assent withdrawal. So if they are saying like, no, I'm not doing this right now. All right. I'm going to honor that right now because I understand that this isn't over time. I'm not reinforcing this behavior over time. I'm briefly reinforcing this moment, right? I'm briefly providing a contingency that's preferred for the sake of the therapeutic relationship because I want to continue to be a safe and trusted person throughout this behavior change process. And especially when we're talking about learners who are autistic or with intellectual disabilities, that's even more important because so often in their learning histories, adults have done nothing but like push them. They are not trusted. They are not safe people. I've only been taught that I should comply or there are consequences for not, right? So we want to be the opposite of that so that they can discriminate between safe adults and unsafe adults. Cool. Any questions about this article in particular? Beautiful. Okay. So, and again, we're just moving forward as though it is not January 30th, 2025. We're pretending that it's December 30th, 2024 or January 19th, 2025. Nothing has changed in our conversation right now.
Mm.
Okay. So these are the legal requirements and constraints and considerations for when you are conducting a functional behavior assessment and creating a behavior intervention plan. This is under the laws protected by a free and appropriate education as well as IDEA. IDEA is a codified law that has been passed by Congress. It cannot be removed without an act of Congress. So all of these things that we're talking about today are things that have to happen in the public education school setting as of today. Most of these are also what we would consider best practices if they are not actual legal requirements. And the reason that we say that they're actually best practices is because underlying our whole purpose of our code of ethics as behavior analysts is do no harm. That's what all of IDEA, that is what all of these laws and protections are for, is to prevent harm to individuals with disabilities, as well as to prevent harm towards people who work with individuals with disabilities. So it's twofold. When we are with acting in good faith, then there's less likely that we are less likely to cause harm, and there's less likelihood that harm will be caused towards us, right? And it's just the right thing to do. So, what I love about this article is that it does lay everything out for you pretty well. It also goes through many different types of students who you may encounter as a behavior analyst in a school setting and just in the community. I don't know if I've shared with y'all, I started working with I've had many different jobs, but working with children, I've worked with regular old, typically developing neurotypical children. They're really boring, super bratty, and just not that much fun, in my opinion. Then I worked with kids who have, and I say that because those are also my children. But when their ADHD characteristics come out is when I'm like, yes, there's the fun. No, I'm kidding. I love all children. But I do find a special place in my heart for the ones that have interesting behaviors. But I got started working in Los Angeles with children who had been in maybe their third or fourth home at the age of like 3 or 4. So a lot of emotional behavioral disorder, a lot of reactive attachment disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, a lot of things along that nature at a very young age. So emotions are like, I'm like, yes, I love talking about emotions and how emotions and behavior work together, because emotions are essentially SDs for behavior. That's something we can talk about later. But that's one of the reasons why I love those articles, because it talks a lot about emotional disturbance in children and the challenges that come with trying to assess these types of placements. Because these are often like, we get called in whenever they're like, there's a challenging behavior, and you're like, okay, well, what's their diagnosis? They don't have a diagnosis. It's probably this. It is probably some sort of emotional disturbance that's going on that's evoking this behavior, right? And so that's why sometimes like these types of assessments are a little bit more tricky, or a little trickier. But we do have to think about, how do we prevent harm when we are conducting these assessments, and then creating a behavior intervention plan that's going to support this behavior within the environment, especially in the school setting or in the community setting. Okay, so the Zirkle et al. Article goes beyond what the rationale for best practices is, but it also talks about what those legal requirements are. So where I'm going to skip the part where it's just like the brief overview, because I'm pretty sure we got a pretty good overview of that when we were reading chapter 27 of Cooper. But when we look at IDEA, going back to legislation from 2004, in the regulations that were amended within 2006, there are specifics that have to happen within behavior intervention plans. So it's important that we have a good understanding of what those are. So this is what I was talking about earlier. If somebody elopes or attempts to elope or run from the building legally in a school setting, you cannot stop them. So when we're thinking about the assessment process, that's what I'm talking about, like the natural environment setting. You can't actually conduct an FA as Iowata presented to us many years ago, you can't conduct an experimental FA in a school setting because you cannot prevent them from leaving a room in that way. So that's one of the legal things to consider when you're thinking about what type of FBA are you going to be conducting. Well, it's not going to be that one if you're going to be in a school.
You don't mean like leaving the building though, right? Like if they were about to leave the building,
You
were
may
you
not
able,
stop
are you
them.
like,
You may not stop them. It's called a run stop. They have to have it specifically written in their behavior intervention plan. There also has to be an imminent risk for them.
okay,
And that imminent risk cannot just be leaving the campus.
so
The imminent risk has to be there's a car coming.
it takes that, really?
So,
That's
and I'm saying this because like if there's any sort of gray area and you're in the gray, the law's not on your side. And that's really what this article is trying to set you up for success to understanding, which is you cannot be in the gray area when it comes to students, children, and their behaviors, and then how you respond to them. I know.
so, oh my God, yeah, because that is, I don't, I feel like that's almost like, I know it would be unethical to do, but I almost feel like that's inhumane to let them do that. You know what I mean? Like, especially like the schools I go to, the parking lot's right there. Like,
Mhm.
that's crazy.
So kind of think of it like this. Your child is about to walk into the street and there's an oncoming car. You can't stop them.
So you
Is basically what the law is saying.
so
But
you
you should
can
stop.
do that. So if
Okay.
your child, let's say this is exact so it sounds so extreme because it is kind of that extreme. So this is what you do. You follow them. You keep your eyes on them. If they are about to go into the street and there is a car, you may do a run stop,
Okay.
but you may not stop them from walking out of the building.
Other like administrative
I've worked with
consequences?
many a runner, and that's what we've done is like we allow them to leave because essentially, for the most part, I've had one kid actually make it home, like all the way home, which was pretty amazing. But very rarely is that what their goal is. Usually their goal is, are they actually going to let me leave? And then they usually don't know what they're going to do after they leave. And so it's just kind of like wandering around. Like
Yeah.
90% of the time, with the exception of the kid who made it home, they just are just kind of like wandering around the campus. I've had another
Yeah.
kid who that kid was old. He was in high school when he walked home. And that was like 2.5 miles. And then we had another kid whose brother was in the hospital. Parents didn't think that it was a big deal to tell us that this happened. He found out at drop off that his brother was in the hospital. So the entire time we've never seen him try to elope before. His boyfriend is going home. He is going to the hospital to check on his brother.
Oh,
And so we did end up having to call parents to pick him up because we were like, this is unsafe for him.
mhm.
He is essentially like we cannot keep him safely contained inside of the building because he
Yeah.
is trying to go home. And as soon as he got home, he was fine because he saw his brother and that his brother was alive. And then that's an example of like not ongoing reinforcement. Like he didn't always then get to escape home. He only eloped that one time. And there was a very clear antecedent as to why he was trying to get home. This wasn't like trying to contact reinforcement for something. I mean, he was trying to contact reinforcement. He wanted to see his brother,
Yeah.
right? He just couldn't communicate that. Um, but yeah, so but at the same time, like we weren't going to let him go. We weren't going to let him continue to walk. So we kept doing redirections. And so like it took three of us and we just kept like, oh yeah, buddy. And like, well, we're going to walk this way now and be like, we're going to walk this way, you precursor. Right. But he still would turn that way, but then like he would turn again. And so it's like, we were just like constantly walking in circles until his dad was able to get him. Um, but that's usually what ends up happening with elopement is like, they are not actively trying to run away. They literally are, there's usually an underlying reason, right? And you can still keep that person safe without physically holding them and restraining them. Speaking of restraints, that's something else to consider when it comes to IDEA and FAPE. In my opinion, it's also something to consider when we talk about assent and assent withdrawal. We are very much a restraint-free clinic. So we don't restrain our learners. The last time that I have restrained somebody, it was in 2017, and she was actively punching herself in the face. And so I held her arms in a safety care hold, Barbie hands. And as soon as she wasn't actively trying, I let it go, right? And then if she would go up, I would just do a quick check, hands back down. Okay, right? I wasn't actively holding her in any way. But it was still considered a restraint that I had to document. This is something to consider always is, are you doing the least restrictive approach? Because if you're in a school setting and if you're in a moral setting, it's going to be really important to consider this. IDEA does have laws against restraint and seclusion, even though I've been in many schools where I have seen kids in seclusion and restraints. So it's best to practice as outlined by the law versus outlined by what you've seen. The reason why we don't do these types of practices is because it's not safe for them. What's also interesting, I kind of skipped a section, but this goes into some legal cases about why an FBA was important before they went into a BIP. Sorry, that's a big part of our course. I got off onto a tangent about restraints and seclusion, but this is actually like a big piece. So there are legal ramifications to having not assessed the behavior prior to putting in place a behavior intervention plan. Not only does it do non-function based intervention plans rarely work unless by chance you somehow added a little bit of function intervention in there. But there's also there are legal ramifications for having not conducted that kind of assessment before putting in a behavior intervention plan. So anytime that you're doing an IEP, and there's a behavior intervention plan recommended, you have to state what type of functional behavioral assessment was conducted that then concluded what type of behavior intervention plan should be put in place. And then that also has to be a team decision. So it could just be one of you conducting the FBA, but the whole team has to agree to the FBA being conducted, as well as to the recommendations that came from that FBA. And that team includes, obviously, whoever conducted the assessment, such as yourself, the teacher, the caregivers, and usually the student as well. Does that make sense? Cool. So legally, we also have to conduct FBAs. It's not just best practices within ABA. It's also legal and best practices within the school setting as of today. And so nothing else has changed. Okay. Sorry, moving forward just a little bit. This one does have some pretty cool case laws in it. Okay. So yeah, I mean, that's basically the gist of what we need to be considering whenever we're working within schools, is that we can't go rogue on any sort of decisions that we make. It does take the entire team, but then also that the assessment does have to happen before there's any sort of behavior intervention plan that can take place. And then with that behavior intervention, there cannot be anything that would be against IDEA or FAPE, which would be restraint, seclusion. And that's why run stops are also not allowed, is because those are considered restraints and seclusion. Does that make sense? What I have found is that schools often get around the seclusion rule because they say that they aren't alone even though they're often in a room by themselves. But if there's an adult apparently within 3 feet, even behind the other side of a door, they will say that it's not seclusion. And it's just my favorite too is that they call that the sensory room. Like every time that I've ever been into a classroom and there is like some sort of like timeout area, they call it the sensory room. And I'm like, but this room literally just has a crash pad in it and that's it. And they're like, yeah,
I will say
if everybody gets too escalated.
because I went to a school, I think it was out in Sunderland. They had one like that where
Yeah.
it was like white walls and like a crash pad and maybe like one of those like peanut looking like yoga balls
Yep.
versus like I went to another school out in Holyoke and they had a giant like lava lamp thing like attached to the wall and then they had like these really cool like ribbon,
Yes.
like the girls that do like the gymnastics, they have like the ribbons,
The
they'll have
silks.
like that stuff. Yeah, and I'm like, that is a sensory room.
That's how
Not
our
this.
sensory room is. Our sensory room is full of like lights. It has like one of those like electric things where you like put your hand on it and it's like the lightning bolts go up. Lots of different crash pads. So that's like we're like they like modular couches, the crash pad. Yeah. We've got like foam tiles in there too. It's the only room too that doesn't have windows. And so like we'll always have like something projecting pretty much. Or the people like they also like to play laser tag in that room. So
Nice.
okay, so we didn't talk a lot about the FA project, but have either of you kind of talked about or thought about who you have in mind for your project learner?
Yes, I'm debating between two.
Okay, that's perfect. And that's a great way to, that's a great place to start is with, yeah, like two. And then you can kind of narrow it down from there.
Is
Um,
there an outline for it?
so
Like,
that's what I haven't created yet. And I realized that the other day. So I will. I'm going to create just a rubric for y'all so you have a good idea of what to expect for it. And I will
perfect.
publish that by next week. So thank you, Stasia.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
because I was like, I don't know how she wants us to do it, and I want to make sure I'm doing it right.
yeah, no, that's a great point. I'll just I've got one started. I just haven't really finished it and I need to get that hammered out for y'all.
We're all busy people.
Well, but I will say so the biggest thing that will the primary goal of it is just to make sure that you have a really good understanding of the application and practice of conducting an FBA. So making sure that you have a learner or a hypothetical learner who you're like, okay, I've got an idea of like what I want this to look like. And then what we'll do is you'll discuss what the rationale behind choosing the FA is. And that's something that we're going to do in class too, right? So you're not, this won't be like, it's brand new information. You're going to have a really good idea of what you're going to be writing anyway, because we will have discussed it. Then you're going to then you're going to talk about that what happened during the FBA process. So like we set it up on this day. This is what conditions we ran. This is how we ran it. These were my findings. Then for my findings, so you're basically going through the task analysis, right, that you just created. Then for my findings, these are my recommendations for interventions and how we're going to proceed. And that's essentially what you'll do anyway for if somebody says, hey, will you write an FBA and a BIP for me? Sure. That's what this is going to be essentially, except this will be a little bit more academic in writing nature as opposed to most of the time when I write things for a clinic like that, it's a lot of bullet points and not so much paragraph form because people don't read paragraphs. I do, but others don't. Felicia, do you have any questions or thoughts about the FA project?
Um, I have two kiddos in mind, and um, one I think is definitely in need of services, and the other one I think it's just, he's either figuring out who he is and what boundaries he can push.
Yeah. How old is he?
3.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
Does it have to be on a kiddo we're working with?
No, it does not.
I think
Sometimes it's
about what I'm
easier.
doing.
but you don't have to.
Okay. Just because, like, doing it since we already kind of have most of the like the functions for my kiddos, I kind of
Mhm.
want like a bit of more of a challenge to kind
Yeah,
of go outside of the scope, but I think I have an idea now.
cool. Yeah, I think that's absolutely fine. And Felicia, the kiddo who is testing boundaries might be the one then to figure out. Because then you could say, like, okay, let's figure out which boundaries he's truly testing versus, yeah,
Mm,
like, and this will also be the thing to kind of determine what are you going to be measuring? Like, what behavior are you going to be identifying as a thing that's being measured? Because let's say that he engages in like a lot of annoying little behaviors, like you're not going to be able to measure all of those. So you're going to want to measure the ones that happen, but you're like, this is truly a barrier to learning and to his whole environment. Does that make sense?
yes.
Cool. Because like, yeah, I have one kid and we try to score all every time that we have to redirect her, and I'm like, we have to stop. This is too exhausting. So let's choose a few things that we're going to tackle at a time. Yeah, cool. We'll talk more about pinpointing then the behavior next week because that's a fun part. And then because that's part of the indirect assessment. The very first thing that you're going to ask the caregiver is like, tell me what's the behavior that's causing you the most stress? What's the behavior that if you could stop tomorrow, you would stop or have your child stop? Okay, cool. And then we'll also go through we'll do the QABF and the FAST together because they're really quick and easy. But then they also just kind of give you a good understanding too of like some of the questions that you can ask to get a good understanding from caregivers. All right, y'all. Well, rest up. I hope everybody gets some sleep
Hydrate.
and lots of fluids. Stay away from people who are sick. Wash your hands. All right, y'all. Take care, and I will see you next week.
You too. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.